This is Tokens. I'm Lacey Camp, taking the axe to yet another false dichotomy in today's episode.
The Board of Ordained Ministries voted not to ordain me, and after a long struggle, then were forced to ordain me. And they sent me to 4 little congregations in Lawrence County. One of the congregations said they would burn the church down before they would ever let a woman preach from their pulpit.
That's Janet Wolfe, ordained Methodist pastor, longtime justice seeker. Today we discuss her work for justice in the face of misogyny, poverty, racism, and the cradle-to-prison pipeline.
Moments like that remind me of the power of the gospel and the power of community to call us into a whole different place and a different understanding of discipleship. The Word was alive among us, and folks were utterly transformed. It was faith with flesh on it.
All this coming right up. Janet Wolfe has worked as a poverty rights organizer, a United Methodist pastor with urban and rural congregations, a college and seminary professor, learner and teacher with think tanks inside prisons. She works with the Children's Defense Fund, focusing on public theology, transformative justice, and nonviolent direct action, organizing to disrupt and dismantle the cradle-to-prison pipeline. She's also the dean of the Freedom Seminary of the Children's Defense Fund, and her recent book is entitled Practicing Resurrection, The Gospel of Mark and Radical Discipleship. And besides all of that, she's just a genuinely delightful human being to know. Welcome, Janet.
Thank you very much. It's a good gift.
It's great to have you with us today. We're talking to Janet especially about her experience as a woman serving in the church. And it's my understanding that you were the first woman to serve a Methodist church in Lawrence County, Tennessee?
Yeah, I think I was the first woman in any denomination for about a 13-county area on the Tennessee-Alabama line.
Huh. And you were how old at that time?
40.
Okay.
I didn't graduate from divinity school till I was 40.
Yeah. Did you go into that experience expecting any particular difficulties, or what was your kind of vision as a woman going into that role?
I'll just start with Lawrence County, with a very particular place. Although I should back up and say I did not go to divinity school to become a pastor. I did not think people ought to be ordained. I thought clergy were probably the problem and not the solution. I went to figure out how people could read the Bible and not do justice. I went to learn some magical theological language so I could do a better job of working with congregations to focus on justice. And then somewhere along the line, folks kept saying, you can't have a congregation like that. It defies odds. You won't have enough members. You won't collect enough money. And I kept thinking, but that's the gospel. I mean, that's the heart of what we're called to be at the church. So I just think I'll try that. And the Board of Ordained Ministries voted not to ordain me. And after a long struggle, then were forced to ordain me. And they sent me to 4 little congregations in Lawrence County. One of the congregations said they would burn the church down before they would ever let a woman preach from their pulpit. And so the district superintendent, my supervisor, assigned a part-time male pastor to that congregation, so that before I ever went to the congregations, the other 3 churches had lost members to this 4th congregation, so they wouldn't have to deal with a woman who was a pastor. And the beginning was harsh. They boycotted our kids on the bus. They called them children of the devil and wouldn't sit with them. They boycotted our kids at school. Our youngest was starting kindergarten that year, and nobody would sit with him at lunch. And so it was a really harsh experience. It was also a stunning experience of grace. There's a cafeteria worker who lived down the road for us, who took her break every day and ate lunch with Ben in kindergarten. The bus driver decided to pick our kids up first so nobody could move away from them. They were already on the bus. There was a woman, older woman, who was a neighbor, who was there at the bus stop every morning with the kids with freshly baked sourdough bread. And The folks there in Lawrence County and the churches that welcomed us and stood by us paid a much higher price than either I did or my family did, because they had lived there all their lives. And so their willingness to stand up was an extraordinary gift and a sign of fierce faith.
What was it like for you finding inner resources to navigate, especially the sorts of pain that your sons were facing?
Well, I think it was, again, the extraordinary acts of grace that folks offered us. So the counter signs, the bus driver coming to pick kids up first so they wouldn't have folks move away from them when they got on the bus, or the woman who baked a fresh loaf of sourdough bread or muffins for them every morning and sat with them at the bus stop. The cafeteria worker who sat with our kid in kindergarten took her lunch break every day to sit with him. And I think, we had folks who would stand up and walk out when I preached. I got up to preach. They'd sit through the rest of the service. And then when I started to preach, they'd get up and walk out. They usually sat on the front row. And then they'd make a big deal out of walking out. But there were so many acts of kindness and just folks who bet everything on the wideness of God's mercy. And I remember the first funeral I did, and there were people who lined up outside and said, well, she's going to hell for sure, but if you listen to the sound of her voice, you're going to hell with her. And yet,
wow,
the churches, folks continued to show up in the three churches. So at some point, I decided that perhaps a community Bible study would help, and we could engage the Bible and talk about what it means to be church, what the gospel invites us to embody in ways of being church. And so we had a basket, and people would put in stories in the basket, and then we'd pick one out and we'd do a Bible study. And I remember one of the most powerful ones we did, Luke 13, the story of the bent-over woman. And I do participatory Bible studies. So some people were the bent-over women, some people were Jesus, some people were the religious authorities, some people were the crowd. And you really sit in the story from your perspective. So you don't try to explain anybody else's behavior, just yours. Who are you? Why do you do what you do? What are you scared of? What gives you hope? What brings you joy? And so the first night that we did this, they were stuck on what is it that bends women in particular over double for 18 years, quite unable to stand up straight. And they talked about the fact that in this county, the sheriff beat his wife in public so badly that she ended up in the hospital, and he was reelected as sheriff 2 weeks later. That there were no women in any positions of power anywhere in the county. They talked about poverty. They talked about the loss of family farms. They talked about businesses and factories leaving, and the really relentless struggle to get health care, to get education. And it was so thick that they wanted to continue with that same story the next week. So the next week, they got hooked on, whoa, what would it feel like when Jesus calls you a daughter of Abraham? This whole community has ousted you. Religious authorities have the theological justification for why you're not good enough. And then Jesus, in front of everybody, calls you a daughter of Abraham, central to the covenant community, not on the outside, not a leftover, not an afterthought, central. And folks just sat with that and imagined in their own lives what it would mean to be called a valued partner in the faith community by Jesus, in defiance of all these other folks who had labeled you so many other things. So they insisted we do a third week, and the third week they spent time thinking about, so why'd she stay standing up? Jesus moves on. These religious leaders are so angry. The community would have been upset. 18 years, you would have gotten used to being bent over double. There'd be a lot of both physical pain, but also just getting used to things all over again from when you weren't bending over double. Why in the world would she stay standing up straight? And they decided it was because the community, the crowd who danced at the end, the crowd sang to her. They reminded her that she was named by grace with a power that could not come undone. Whenever she forgot, they sang to her again and reminded her. And so we left that night. That was a Wednesday night. On Saturday night, in the middle of the night, I got a phone call. I'll call her, it's not her name, but I'll call her Joanna. And everyone knew that Joanna's husband beat her with some regularity. His family was the largest landholder in the county. And she was calling because he had kicked her with steel-toed cowboy boots, and she needed to go to the hospital. So I picked her up, I took her to the hospital, and I heard a doctor say what I would unfortunately hear again and again. What did you do this time to set him off? Could you just not keep your mouth shut? And Joanna had stitches. They cared for her. We took her back home, tucked her in, hoped she would sleep. The next morning, I'm at the first church. I had services at 9, 10, 11. I'm at the first church, the 9 o'clock church, and I'm in the middle of prayer time asking people, what are your celebrations? What are your concerns you want to lift up today? She walks into the back of the church. By now, her face is swollen. It's multicolored. You can see the stitches. I don't think anybody had ever seen her after a beating before. And she's just standing in the back of the church, tears streaming down her face, and I have not the slightest idea what to do. I remember it just seemed like such a long time thinking about what was the right thing to do. And then her sister-in-law, the sister of the man who beat her, stood up and said, "You are a daughter of Abraham." And then others in the congregation started saying the same thing. One at a time, they would stand up, "You are a daughter of Abraham." And those folks went on to start one of the largest battered women's shelter in rural Tennessee. It was a stunning moment when the gospel took on flesh, when the word was alive among us, and folks were utterly transformed. It was faith with flesh on it. So I think that moments like that feed my soul, remind me of the power of the gospel and the power of community to really bring radical transformation and healing, to call us both individually and communally into a whole different place and a different understanding of discipleship.
Wow, that's incredibly poignant. Thank you. Because I've been familiar with your work for a long time, I know that you have spent a lot of time working on commitments to nonviolence as the shape of pursuing justice. And how do you see that commitment to nonviolence play out in that sort of story you just told, so that nonviolence doesn't become a mechanism of enabling further violence?
I think, so to talk about nonviolence, I grew up on the edges of the civil rights community, so early on kind of explored that, had some experience with some folks from SNCC training our youth group, and seeing, I was in Atlanta, Georgia at the time, seeing the consequences of an alternative approach rather than this full-bodied in the streets, nonviolent direct action organizing. And early on began to understand that that was actually the only option, that you were never going to get anywhere by using the same tools of the system that you were trying to take apart. That investing in beloved community, a culture of peace, a community that was willing to bet everything that the power of love was infinitely more powerful than any form of death, was a source of life, was a source of hope. And I remember in particular in Lawrence County running into the work of Walter Wink. Walter, his book back then, I think had just come out or hadn't been out long, called Naming the Powers. And it made so much sense to me. I told Walter later, it saved my life, because I would look at the folks that I would do pastoral visits with, the folks I sat with in church, and see really sturdy, thickly good folks. And I couldn't understand this ugliness that was coming. I mean, we had Klan members who were part of the church. And so how does all of that add up? I couldn't add up the individuals in the congregation and come out with the kind of violent white supremacy, anti-woman patriarchy that I was seeing. And so listening to Walter Wink and really delving into the book of Revelation and the notion that there are angels in the church, that there's something bigger than the sum of all the individual members. There are forces at work with us, on us, around us, all of the time, shaping how we think, what we see, what we refuse to hear. And that these forces have to be unmasked, they have to be named, they have to be engaged, they have to be transformed. And that's what nonviolence or building beloved community, a culture of peace, does, is exactly that, is to unmask, to name, to engage, to transform. And that then engages these systems, powers, systems of domination that create this web of lies, that create illusions that have so invaded the church and distorted our theology and practices and rituals. And I think that nonviolence is both claiming our power as individuals and our power as communities, that when we believe that there's something in us, this source of love, God has imprinted thick on our hearts. The whole Howard Thurman thing, there's an angel with a sword in the very heart of who you are that guards what God has placed inside you. When we realize we have that power, and then look at what happens when we use it collectively, it's just stunning in its power. So I saw that in Lawrence County. I saw the countering. I saw the alternative. And I saw people against all odds who had never been invited even to think much about the Bible other than listen to what they were being told, become the church. It was really quite something.
So what are some other examples of the ways you saw people becoming the church, as you just alluded to?
I think that the notion of clergy as central, the reason I didn't want to be ordained is because I think clergy have been given such power, and we have swiped the ministry from lay folks. We have occupied that as if it belonged to us, and it did not belong to anyone who was not ordained. And so for me, the power I saw was in people taking back the Bible and taking back the call to ministry. So I'm talking about farmers and factory workers. The average household income was $12,000. Most people hadn't graduated from high school. And they became folks who offered communion, who drove in their pickup trucks down past 3 creeks into the deep holler to talk to people about what they were experiencing and what they were seeing and to share communion. There were examples of egregious community harm that happened from someone within the congregation. And folks in these circles, offering people communion, figured out how to do a form of mediation, how to do a form of listening folks into life. That's an Emily Towns term. You really can listen people into life. You can pull people back from being caught in that web of lies, in that spiral of violence, in the ugly theology that has so demeaned so many of God's children. And so I saw it, and I saw it give life to folks who had never imagined themselves as, in base Christian communities, they call them delegates of the word. But they were. They really reclaimed the Bible, healed some of the most broken places, claimed the power of being the church in the middle of a county. You know, this is one county over from where the Klan was founded. We had a Klan march in our county, and I had a group of pastors, And lay folks try to go meet with the sheriff, and the sheriff said, "Oh, don't worry about me. I was a cop in Birmingham when the Bull Connor was around. I know how to do this stuff." And he's like, that's not a comfort, right?
Yeah.
That's not a comfort that he was a police person in force with Bull Connor. And yet, yeah, the folks were persistent in just putting flesh on faith.
You continue these days to do lots of work and have through the years being present to friends of yours and friends you've come to know in prison. How would you summarize perhaps some of the most important lessons you've learned about what it means to be human from those experiences?
The first one is, I will always get it wrong. Philip Gorovich wrote a book on Rwanda, and in it he talks about coercive power as the power that forces others to inhabit your version of their reality. And I think for all of us who have not been caged, that's true. I've been going into prison since 1975, and I will always get it wrong. I will never know what that cage is like or what it means to be criminalized, to be invisibilized, to be so utterly dismissed, rendered disposable. And I think the other part of that is I learn over and over again the capacity of people to love, the power of love, and the gift of people. John Sabrino talks about the luxury of despair. Folks with the Howard Thurman term, their backs against the wall, pushed way back against the wall by systems and structures, theologies and practices, do not have the luxury of despair. To get up and hope every day, to bet that love is more powerful than death, is an absolute requirement for survival. And so I think a lot of people like me, white, middle income, formally educated, all those things, do have the luxury of despair and sometimes give in. I find hope inside prison walls as I see people create alternative communities. So we have a circle on death row. When we first started the circle and I asked, what do you want to focus on? They said community building, nonviolence, and conflict resolution.
Wow.
It's like, oh, well, all right then. So we have trained, I believe, 14 mediators. They take the same course as people who are certified by the Tennessee Supreme Court are required to take. They practice mediation. And so when I go into our circle, we start out with meditation. The meditation is in a room where there are officers moving around and other folks, and cells are clanging, and there's a lot of noise, just loud, and yelling, and things clanking. And we sit in a circle and we do meditation, and in that moment we become an alternative community. So the very folks that the state has targeted to murder, and they have murdered some members of our circle, they are the folks who create the possibilities of an alternative community in the belly of the beast. They're the folks who love each other and love larger than the circle, to spill out into doing mediation, into creating a culture of peace right there on death row. At one point, they were communicating with one of our young organizers who was working with Black and brown high school kids who were way far on the edge, in danger of getting kicked out of school, struggling with the streets. And our circle on death row wrote letters to them. They were not scared straight letters. They were, we know what it means to feel like a piece of trash on the side of the highway that nobody notices. They were letters that say, even when you get to a point and you think no one sees you or hears you, please know that we do. And we're going to be there for you. The world has done things to you that ought not to have happened. But there's more than you've yet seen. And we believe in you. You are the gift we are waiting for. Just such a powerful notion. Two of the people who wrote in that book have been murdered in state-sanctioned executions. So yeah, I often argue, I'm going to the prison. It takes a long time to check in. Officers are grumpy. I might not get in. My materials might not get in. I don't have time for this. And I always come out laughing and hopeful. It is a source of life. I think the best theology happening is behind prison walls. I believe the church just might be saved if we could be among those who are caged or formerly caged, not to save anybody, but to allow ourselves to be redeemed. And do me a lot to Shawnee, who spent 20 years on Tennessee's death row for a crime he did not commit. Said all of those years, folks from the church kept coming in trying to save my soul. Hell, I didn't need anybody to save my soul. I need somebody to save my ass. If the church could hear the challenge to our theologies and our practices, our complicity, Walter Wink calls us kept chaplains of an unjust order, we would be challenged and changed. I think we could be converted and might actually become disciples.
You're listening to Tokens, Public Theology, Human Flourishing, The Good Life, and we are always most grateful to have you joining us. Thanks so much for all of you who are telling your friends about the Token Show podcast and radio broadcasts. Hope you'll bring more into the fold. If you've not yet done so, do subscribe today to the Tokens podcast on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, CastBox, or wherever you get your favorite podcasts. And go over there and give us a little love and one of those 5-star reviews. We do love hearing from you and are always pleased to hear some of the things you'd like to hear more about. You can email us at podcast@tokenshow.com. Remember, you can sign up for our email list or find out how to join us for a live event, all at tokenshow.com. Do come see us here in Nashville. This is our interview with Janet Wolfe. Though we did not get to discuss it in this interview, I'd recommend you check out Janet's new book, Practicing Resurrection, The Gospel of Mark and Radical Discipleship. Coming up, more on women, religion, and liberation, part 2, in just a moment. Welcome back to Tokens and our interview with Janet Wolfe.
Before I went to divinity school, it never occurred to me that women were central to the ministry, execution, and crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. It never occurred to me. All 4 Easter gospel stories have women at the center.
Right.
And I'd been in church since the day I was born, and it never occurred to me. I encountered that story at the end, towards the end of Mark and the end of Matthew, about the woman who breaks in to the gathering of disciples in Jesus, unwanted, uninvited, unacceptable. A lot of grumbling by disciples. She anoints Jesus with oil, and Jesus says, wherever the gospel is proclaimed, in the whole world, wherever the gospel is proclaimed, this woman's story will be remembered. In remembrance of her, he says, our communion words, in remembrance of her. And I wondered then what that meant to folks like me who had not heard the gospel, feeling like women were actually disciples. And then I stumbled into that Matthew 15, Mark 7 story of the Canaanite woman. So again, someone outside the covenant, someone who doesn't belong, someone who won't go away despite all the ugly things that are thrown at her, someone who will not be silenced, someone who refuses to believe it is God's will that her child remain sick, that there is a narrow theology that excludes her child. And Jesus is utterly transformed. And you think about, that caught me because I thought, the gospel's not written for unbelievers. The gospel's written to challenge and transform the church, to convert us into actually being disciples. And all these years later, the story's there in 2 of the gospels, and disciples are arguing over, why this one? No, not this woman, send her away. And the church has not yet been transformed by women. So I wanted to mention, I went to the Reimagining Conference in 1993 in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Almost 2,000 women, I believe, ecumenical. with folks like Mary Daly. My favorite phrase of Mary Daly's is turning the noun of knowledge into the verb of knowing. Folks, womanist theologians like Dolores Williams, who challenge the atonement theories and what that means in our theologies. And I remember coming back and thinking, I expected something a bit more radical. And then to be met with public clamor that any of us who went were heretics. It was idolatry. It was heresy. My children should be taken away. My ordination papers should be taken away. It was stunning. And it rippled through all the denominations that participated because women dared to do theology, dared to challenge this male dominance that had so long, 1993, silenced our voices, dismissed our stories, and perpetuated the male-dominated theology and church institutions. And it was a really good gift. I had reporters show up at the church to challenge me on why I thought I could get away with going to this reimagining conference. And it was such a powerful reminder for me that the patriarchy, the violence that silences women, dismisses our stories, renders our experiences unworthy, is built into the theology and practices of the church, built into the very institution itself. It's not accidental. And it will take more than individuals to change that. It's going to take a movement of folks. I have the privilege of working with a number of young organizers, and I believe they are the best version of church going these days. Their capacity for love, their capacity for hope, their insistence that we not compromise, that we not become complicit, that we get up every day and figure out what we have to unlearn, what we have to let go of, what we have to resist, where we have to heal, and to develop collective rituals and theologies that transform the communities around us.
I've heard you tell a story about your memory of the first time you heard a woman preach.
Oh, yeah. Well, because I was raised in a denomination where women and girls, we couldn't take up the offering. We couldn't read the gospel. We couldn't offer a prayer, let alone preach. And that internalized oppression is deep. I think I'm still digging patriarchy out of my insides. So the first time I saw a woman preach, I remember thinking, who does she think she is? I was thinking about the stunning turn and all that. I became one. And then the last congregation that I pastored, there was a little girl who grew up in the congregation with me as a pastor. And when we had a male pastor come to preach one day, she turned to her mom and said, I didn't know men could be preachers. It's so much the power of social location.
Yeah.
What we see when we open our doors, who we listen to, that defines how we think about the world. And I do think that the invitation for us, which is classic gospel, is again to go to the Howard Thurman's wall and there to listen and to sit long enough to be converted and to have our eyes and ears and hearts and minds opened so that we might really hear. I'm convinced we cannot hear the radicality of the gospel unless we are there.
One other story you shared with me that I'd love to hear you tell again about your door knocking in your early days there in Lawrence County.
Oh, yeah. So I remember when I first got to Lawrence County, I thought, they didn't know anything about me. They just knew I was a woman. They didn't know who I was or what I'd done or what my theology was or anything. So I figured, well, the best thing is you just go meet people. And so I went around, I knocked on people's doors, and there was this one woman. I knocked on her door. She opens the door after I knock quite a long time. And I say, hi, I'm your new pastor, Janet Wolfe. She slams the door. I think, well, I probably spoke too fast, so I'll be slower. She just didn't hear what I was trying to say. Knock, knock, knock. Open the door. Hi, I'm your new pastor, Janet Wolfe. I slam. Like, huh. Maybe I wasn't loud enough. Knock, knock, knock. Hello, I'm your new pastor, Janet Wolf. She says, no, you're not. You're a woman, and slams the door. I mean, that happened repeatedly, even later on with churches where folks just didn't know anything about who I was or what I thought or the way I believed faith might look, but saw me only as a woman, and that was enough to end the conversation. In one congregation that I served, there was a woman on the sick and shut-in list that I kept trying to visit, and she always turned me down. I sent notes, I sent cards, I made phone calls, but she would not let me come visit. And then I got a notice from hospice that she was dying. So I wrote her a note and said that I'd gotten the information and I would very much like to bring the love from her congregation and just spend a few minutes with her. And she initially turned me down, and then I called her up on the phone. I said, just 10 minutes. Just give me 10 minutes. I want to convey the concern the congregation has. Just would love to just sit with you for 10 minutes. And she begrudgingly like, And so I went and knocked on the door. And when I sat next to her, she had a big watch on, and she said, 10 minutes, and I'm counting every one of them. So you're here, and that's because you know when I'm going to die, you know how I'm going to die, you know what happens at the moment I die. That's great, you go. And so I spent a few minutes, trying to say, oh, yeah, I know none of those things. What I do know is that God is with you, the congregation is sending their concern, whatever, and she keeps looking at her watch, and I said, I'll tell you what, why don't I leave now, and then I'll come back. She said, well, you have 3 minutes left. I said, okay, I'll come back and I will claim those 3 minutes. And she said, yeah, and I'll be watching 3 and only 3. But I persisted and she persisted and we became good friends. It was an extraordinary relationship. I learned a lot from her. And I did find that the reason she didn't want me there was because I was a woman. And she did not believe women had any direct connection to God. So I would only get in her way. She was also a hardcore racist. Our church had grown from 30 older white folks to 200 dramatically diverse congregation, different languages, different cultures, different colors, different ideas, different economic backgrounds. And not long before her death, maybe 2 weeks before her death, she calls me to tell me that she's feeling a little better and her son's bringing her to church. And I think, oh my God, she will die right there on the spot. I mean, I know she's a hardcore racist. I have not been able to dent that at all. She will come into the church. She will see all the children I've been talking about who are mostly Black and brown, and she'll die right there in the pew on a Sunday morning. This is a terrible, awful thing. The Sunday came, and she came early, and I just dreaded it, that she was, as people came in, it would get worse and worse, and then she'd die on the spot. After the service, she was absolutely elated because she had seen the church she loved thrive. Kids sang, they were jumping up and down, they were happy. There were chairs in the aisle. And so the power of that moment, again, when folks encounter faith in the flesh, it utterly transforms us. I think that what the church has gotten wrong so often is we think faith is some kind of dogma. It's a set of ideas. It's something we clip on our chest to say we belong to the club. But faith in the gospel is something you can see. There's a great story in Mark 2 about the guys lowering the person through the roof on the mat. And it says, when Jesus saw their faith. And then you look at all the other examples of faith in the New Testament and the gospel in particular, and it's all stuff with flesh on it. It's all very concrete. And that's what changes the world. It's not the songs we sing. It's not our nice ideas. It's not our dogma. It's not all the resolutions we pass. It's not the particulars of the polity. It is when folks see this alternative, this kingdom of God, this call into a Jesus movement, which is radically different from most of the churches.
We've been talking to Janet Wolfe, works with the Children's Defense Fund, focusing on public theology, transformative justice, and nonviolent direct action. Also the Dean of the Freedom Seminary of the Children's Defense Fund. Janet, thanks so much for being with us. We're grateful for you and grateful for your time.
Thank you. It's a good gift. I'm so grateful for your work and your witness. You know, I quoted you at least twice in the book I wrote on the Gospel of Mark.
I'm privileged.
But more than your words, I find your witness both healing and hopeful. And I thank you for all you are doing to invite us into a different way of being with each other. Blessings, gratitude.
Thank you, Janet. That means very much. Thank you. You've been listening to Tokens, Public Theology, Human Flourishing, and the Good Life, and our episode with Janet Wolfe. If you'd like to hear more about various concerns and issues at the intersection of Christian theology, American culture, and women challenging the status quo, we have several additional episodes you might find of much interest by Professor Beth Allison Barr, Professor Kristen DeMay, and Professor Lauren White, each in a separate episode. Remember, you can subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your favorite podcasts. If you've got feedback, we'd love to hear from you. Email us, podcast@tokenshow.com. Thanks to all the stellar team that makes this podcast possible. Executive producer and manager Christy Bragg, Bragg Management, co-producer Jacob Lewis, Great Feeling Studios, associate producers Ashley Bain, Tom Anderson, engineer Carrie Harmon, music beds by Zach and Maggie White, and Blue Dot Sessions. Thanks for listening, and peace be unto thee. Tokens Podcast is a production of Tokens Media, LLC, and
Great Feeling Studios.